Greetings and welcome to the channel. This is Mikhailov from Team Retrogue, where we like retro games and the devices that bring them to us. This handheld is the GameMT E6 Plus, a dual-boot Linux and Android handheld that is one of the newer entries in the line of rock chip handhelds you can purchase for under $100. In this video, we're going to put this very purple handheld through its paces and see if it is worth your hard-earned dollar bucks. So without further delay, let's dive in and get to work. At time of recording, the E6 Plus can be purchased from the GameMT Direct Store on AliExpress for about $70 with free shipping. The review unit featured in this video was sent to me by GameMT for the purposes of this review. As is always required, all opinions are my own, I'm not being paid, and they are not seeing this video before it is published. Now it's time to hop onto our mount and ride into Spec Town. The E6 Plus is powered by an RK3566 CPU with 4 cores and 4 threads. The GPU is an ARM Mali G52. There is 32 gigabytes of onboard storage for Android with microSD card expansion through 2 microSD card slots. The screen is a 5-inch 720p IPS screen with a 16:9 aspect ratio. Giving the device life is a 5,000 mAh battery. This handheld has Wi-Fi built in, but no Bluetooth. There is a port for HDMI out via an HDMI cable, and the device ships with both Android 11 and Linux on an 8GB SD card. So let's go ahead and unbox this purple monster. In the box is a GameMT logo card, the device itself, a charging cable, and a set of 3.5mm wired earbuds. I don't normally see earbuds bundled with handhelds, so this was an interesting inclusion. You also get a manual and a screen protector. Now let's tour the device, starting at the top with the shoulder buttons. These are, well, they're not good. They have very little travel and are just loud. They feel, look, and sound very cheap. Here's a quick listen. Moving on, you have a volume control, 3.5mm headphone jack, the mini HDMI out port, 2 USB-C ports, dual SD card slots, one for the LinuxOS, and one for storage, a power button, and the right shoulder and trigger buttons. There's no I/O on the sides, so let's move to the front of the device with this D-pad. I can't sugarcoat it. This is the worst D-pad I have ever tested on a handheld. In addition to the fact that it just doesn't feel that good, it registers accidental inputs like you wouldn't believe. Forget the Contra tests and the fighting game tests, although it did fail those spectacularly. Let's just try to navigate a menu. Every time I use the D-pad to try to navigate down, the D-pad automatically registers a right input. Not only does this mess me up in menus and games, but it also just doesn't feel good. It's just a bad D-pad. Let's move on. The left joystick is a Hall sensor joystick, and the middle is the 5-inch screen. Screen itself is good. It's a serviceable screen, but definitely not on par with the screens on the iNeo Pocket Air or the Odin 2 Mini. The right joystick is not a Hall sensor joystick. It makes zero sense to me why there are 2 different joysticks on this device. This seems to be a cost-cutting measure, but when I asked about it, I was told that a Hall sensing right joystick was, quote, not necessary. These face buttons are also not great. They seem to be a single unit, so when I go to press one button, I could see the other 3 also start to depress slightly. With the face buttons at least, I haven't had any issues with accidental inputs, but it still doesn't feel or look quite right. The back of the unit has vents for cooling, as well as the controller bumps to help with ergonomics. And I could say, well, this device has a lot of shortcomings so far. It is one of the more comfortable handhelds I have held at the sub $100 price point. Let's go ahead and turn this device on, and the first thing you're going to notice are these LEDs around the joysticks and along the front of the device. These lights are only one color, and they are insanely bright. They're so bright, in fact, that they just cause all of this light bleed in the D-pad and all the way up to even the shoulder buttons. At the sub $100 price point, the inclusion of these LEDs seem a very unnecessary expense for something that most users are just going to turn off. And thankfully, there are settings on both the Linux and the Android side to turn these lights off and never look back. So let's go ahead and do some comparisons to some other handhelds. I spent most of my time on the Linux side of the E6 Plus, which appears to be a modified version of Gelos. This is where the lower end systems will work best, and it's the version of the handheld that will give you the least amount of trouble. I found the screen to handle GBA particularly well, and so the majority of my time with this device was spent playing GBA games. Even with the bad D-pad, it was a pretty decent experience. But nothing about this handheld stood out as spectacular except the ergonomics. It is definitely more comfortable for longer play sessions than the Odin 2 Mini, but I'll definitely pick up the Odin 2 Mini over this because it's just a better built handheld. The E6 Plus is also not as comfortable as the iNeo Pocket Air. However, it is definitely cheaper than the Odin 2 Mini and the iNeo Pocket Air. So let's pump the brakes for a second and take a look at a couple of devices that are around the same price point as the E6 Plus, but will give you a better experience. And let's start with the Powkiddy RGB10 Max 3. This device has a Linux-only operating system, so there's no Android here. I'm currently using Rocknix, but for the price, the hardware is similarly performant as the E6 Plus, and it's also better. You won't run into D-pad issues, for example. The screen is also a 5-inch 720p screen, and the ergonomics are just as comfortable as the E6 Plus. There's also another handheld called the TrimUI Smart Pro. I did a video on this a while back, and this handheld actually surprised me. It's not as ergonomic as the RGB10 Max 3 or the E6 Plus, but it is just as performant, able to play up to Dreamcast and PSP on the single OS that it provides. This also does not have an Android side, but it also doesn't really need it. This handheld is also priced at or around $80. I'll leave a link to my review in the video description. Getting back to the GameMT E6 Plus. The problem here is that I've already found and presented two options that are already better than the E6 Plus and cost around the same as the E6 Plus. So this unit really doesn't stand out in a crowd. There's nothing here convincing me to buy this over any of the other offerings at or near this price point, because literally anything else you can get for $60 to $100 is just a better overall experience than this handheld. Now that said, the E6 Plus does play retro games, and it does play them decently. As I mentioned before, this Linux build is a modified version of Gelos, which is already a very mature operating system, and it'll play games up to PS1 just fine. But GBA is really where it's at on the Linux side. The screen is just about perfect for the 3:2 aspect ratio that GBA uses. You might struggle with platformers and fighting games due to the D-pad, but more simple games like Kirby, Pokemon, and other RPGs and turn-based games will serve you well on this device. I also tested Portmaster, and it just didn't work. I couldn't get it to load at all, even when attempting to manually import the games. The port section never showed up on the menu. This tells me that there is something up with this custom Gelos build, because it is filled with small little bugs like this. However, on the Powkiddy RGB10 Max 3, there are none of these issues, and I could get several Portmaster games to run on this thing just fine. And yet again, this just serves to be an overall better experience than the E6 Plus. If you want to press more power out of this device, you're going to have to boot into the Android 11 side, which presents itself with more opportunities, but also more issues. To start, I had to switch the system language to English, which required me to bumble around the settings a bit. My specific review unit does have Google Play, but at first, it would not let me log in, saying that the device was not official. I was able to register the device with Google Play Protect using a method I'll link to in the description, but I shouldn't have had to do that. And customers buying this handheld might think that it's broken. GameMT did inform me that retail versions of this handheld are going to remove the Google Play Store, but I kind of wish they would just register their devices instead. Not including the Play Store makes this a very bare bones Android experience, which can be both good and bad. On the one hand, you don't have Google Play services bogging down the device, but now retail customers will have to sideload everything, which could be a learning experience, and you'll be stuck with emulators and maybe a few Android games. Now, once you're set up, you could do a few things on the Android side that you can't do on the Linux side. For example, I found myself really enjoying the APK of Balatro, and I was glad that it ran with no problems. Also, where I found myself struggling with performance on the Linux side for N64, PSP, and Dreamcast, I had no issues on the Android side. What I found was that the custom build of Jealous that this device uses on the Linux side does not let you use a Vulkan backend. But here, on the Android side, there is no problem switching to Vulkan, and I found that I could play a good majority of Dreamcast and a decent selection of PSP. So having a dual boot system can be beneficial here, and the joystick placement makes these higher games more comfortable to play, especially when you don't have to deal with that D-pad. Streaming is another possibility on the Android front end due to the built-in Wi-Fi chip, and it does work. But I found the screen to be a little too small for my liking. However, Moonlight works just fine on the Android side if you're connecting locally at home, even though this device only really has a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi chip. Alright, we've covered quite a bit here, so let's go ahead and start to wrap things up with my final thoughts. And let's start with the positives. I like that you could choose to boot into Linux or Android, and the procedure is pretty simple to jump back and forth. So you do have some options on what to do on each operating system. The joystick placement is actually pretty good for some systems like N64, Dreamcast, and also PC streaming, and I always find myself enjoying 16:9 screens more than 4:3 screens. And this device is no exception because it makes GBA and PSP look their best. I also like the ergonomics on this device. There are only 3 devices that are this comfortable at this price point, and the GameMT E6 Plus is one of them. But of course, no device is perfect, and unfortunately, there were a lot of decisions made that are questionable with the E6 Plus. The D-pad is still one of the worst D-pads I've ever used. I cannot recommend this device as a D-pad centric device as a result, and if older systems like NES and Game Boy are what you're looking for, there are much better options at the sub $100 price point than the E6 Plus. I also can't imagine why they would put in 2 different types of joysticks other than to cut costs on manufacturing the device. If you're buying Hall effect sticks anyway, why not just have the joysticks match? It's definitely an odd choice, and I wish I had a better explanation as to why that decision was made. The LED lights could have been left out of this handheld. For example, in order to accommodate a second joystick with a Hall sensor, because these lights are useless. They're too bright and they're not necessary. I turned them off as soon as I could. I also think that the issue of the Play Store not working out of the box and the subsequent decision to potentially remove it are both aspects of the device that hurt its marketability. It's lose-lose here. On one end, people don't want to go through the extra hoops to certify the Play Store, but on the other end, people will complain that the device doesn't have Play Store. It's a slippery slope, and I think the only fix is to have Play Store working out of the box. Likewise, if you stick to Linux, there are bugs, glitches, and freezes that simply don't exist on other RK3566 handhelds. And finally, this handheld doesn't do anything special to stand out at this price point. It doesn't do anything that other handhelds at this price point don't do, and so when given the choice between a Powkitty device, a TrimUI, or this handheld, I think most will pick from the other two before gravitating toward the E6 Plus, because those handhelds, while still not perfect, are more fleshed out. Therefore, my concern is that the E6 Plus does not do anything that would make a consumer look at it and say, I want that. And other handhelds on the market do manage to do that. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a device you are considering? Do you have one? And what do you think is the best use case for a device like this? And please feel free to continue the conversation on the Retro Handhelds and the Steam Machine Discords, where you could find me hanging out in between videos. And if you want to support the show, like these wonderful people on the screen, you can do so by going to my Patreon page. Links for all those places are in the description. That'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and please be sure to like and subscribe if this video was helpful to you in any way. Every smash of that button helps the channel grow and allows me to get more content out to you. But until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.